I want to start with a story from 2400 years ago because I think it explains what's happening in the Persian Gulf right now better than any news broadcast can. In 415 BC, Athens was riding the high of a peace treaty with Sparta. The war had gone reasonably well, nobody had truly won, nobody had truly lost, and a fragile agreement called the Peace of Nisches kept both sides from finishing what they'd started. Then a faction in Athens, restless and ambitious, convinced the assembly that peace was a waste of Athenian strength. They sailed for Sicily instead, chasing a decisive victory the treaty had denied them. We know how that ended, Thucydides spent a whole book on it. I bring this up not because history repeats, it doesn't, but because the psychology of powerful states that cannot accept an inconclusive outcome repeats constantly. And that's exactly the situation unfolding right now between Washington and Tehran, playing out this week on a stage most people wouldn't expect. A NATO summit in Turkey. So let's lay out where we actually are, because the last few months have moved fast enough that even careful observers have lost the thread, and because you can't understand this story without a little background on the players involved. Start with NATO itself, since it's become an unlikely backdrop to all of this. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a military alliance formed in 1949, originally by the US, Canada, and a group of Western European countries, as a defensive pact against the Soviet Union. Today it has 32 members spanning North America and Europe. Its founding promise, Article 5, says an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. That's the guarantee that's held the alliance together for 75 years. Crucially, NATO wasn't built for wars in the Middle East. Its focus, especially over the last decade, has been European security, mainly deterring Russia. Keep that in mind, because part of the friction this week is Trump pushing NATO allies to back a war that isn't really what the alliance was designed for. Now to the war itself. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel opened hostilities against Iran with a decapitation strike, an attempt to end the Islamic Republic's chain of command in a single stroke, the way you'd try to end a chess game by removing the king before the opponent notices. On February 28th, that strike killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had ruled the country for 37 years. It also killed several members of his family. His daughter, a son-in-law, a grandchild, and a daughter-in-law were reported among the dead, and there were unconfirmed reports that some grandchildren were killed as well. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a head of state killed by a foreign power in a strike meant to trigger regime collapse. It did not trigger regime collapse. That is the single most important fact in this entire story, and I want you to hold on to it because everything downstream follows from it. A week later, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, was named the new supreme leader by Iran's Assembly of Experts. The Pentagon says he was wounded and likely disfigured in the same strike that killed his father. Since then, he has not appeared publicly. No video, no audio, only written statements read aloud on state television. Think about that. For a second, a new supreme leader, unseen, unconfirmed in health, ruling a nation of roughly 90 million people through proxies and paper statements in the middle of a shooting war. That's either a sign of a regime in genuine disarray or a sign of a regime that's learned the hard way that visibility is vulnerability and adjusted. Accordingly, I lean toward the second reading because everything else about Iran's conduct since February suggests an institution optimizing for survival rather than one cracking under the strain. The war itself ran for about 44 days. Somewhere in there, both sides found reasons to stop, at least on paper. An interim memorandum of understanding was signed in mid-June, easing sanctions, restoring some limited ability for Iran to sell oil, opening a diplomatic channel. For a few weeks, there was something that looked from a distance like a ceasefire settling into a peace. Then, in the first days of July, ships were struck in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas exports pass through. Whoever can threaten shipping there has enormous leverage because disrupting that traffic can spike global oil prices almost overnight. The American side described this as an unprovoked attack on merchant shipping. Reports from the region described something messier: tankers moving through a corridor Iran had unilaterally guaranteed safe passage through, and a decision somewhere in Washington to test that guarantee by routing traffic differently, whatever the precise sequence. The result was the same. Ships got hit, and the US responded within hours with new strikes on Iranian territory, hitting more than 90 targets along Iran's coastlines and reimposing oil sanctions that had just been eased. A US official called it punishment and said flatly that it wouldn't be over quickly. Iran didn't back down. It struck us military positions across the Gulf, in Bahrain and Kuwait, and Iranian air defenses shot down at least one American surveillance drone. Reports put its value in the tens of millions of dollars, part of a pattern. The US has lost a striking number of drones to Iranian air defenses since the war began, worth, by some estimates, close to $1 billion in total. If you're counting, this was not the first one Iran has taken out of the sky. So here's the state of play. The memorandum is functionally dead. Trump has said as much publicly at a NATO summit of all places, And all of this is happening in the same week Iran is burying its supreme leader in a funeral procession of staggering scale, crowds in Tehran alone in the millions, processions moving into the Iraqi holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, where several million more reportedly turned out despite the summer heat, with Iranian authorities projecting total participation across the week from Iran, Iraq, and beyond as high as 30 million people. I want to slow down on that funeral because I think a lot of coverage has missed its significance, and this is where the strategic picture gets useful rather than decorative. When you assassinate a head of state hoping to trigger collapse, you're making a bet that the population's attachment to the regime is thinner than its own. Propaganda suggests, and that once the figurehead is gone, the structure underneath cracks. That's not a crazy bet. It's worked before elsewhere, against other regimes. It did not work here. What we're watching instead is one of the largest funeral processions in modern history, drawing not just Iranians but Iraqi Shia communities, who shut down provincial government for days to make the pilgrimage. If your theory was that killing this man would fracture Iranian society, and instead you get processions in the millions and open calls for retaliation, that theory has failed a very expensive, very public test, and regimes that survive assassination attempts on their top leadership don't typically become more moderate afterward. They become more paranoid, more consolidated, and considerably more committed to proving the killing accomplished nothing. Now, why did the war restart at all? Because I don't think either side's official explanation holds up cleanly. The American explanation is that Iran attacked shipping and had to be punished. Fine, as far as it goes. But ask a more basic question. Why would Iran risk reigniting a war it had just paused in the exact week it's trying to bury its own leader with maximum solemnity and minimum distraction? That's strategically incoherent unless you think Iran wanted this specific moment of vulnerability to also become a moment of provocation, which makes no sense. The more coherent reading, and I want to be careful here because the reporting is contested, is that this was a test of the shipping corridor Iran had set up, and someone in Washington decided to see what would happen if traffic didn't use it. Someone underestimated how seriously Iran would take that test. But there's a second, quieter answer, and it's the one Thucydides would recognize immediately. The ceasefire was never really accepted by the side that started the war. A 44-day campaign that ends with the target's supreme leader dead and the regime still standing is not a victory in any framework that matters to the people who launched it at best. It's an extremely expensive stalemate. States don't enjoy publishing that verdict about themselves. The domestic incentive is always to find the next provocation, declare the pause a failure, and go back for the decisive result that never came the first time. That's Sicily. And there's an ordinary, unglamorous political calendar sitting underneath all of this. American midterm elections are a few months out, and an administration heading into them with a war that produced an assassination but not a surrender has every incentive to reframe the story before voters go to the polls. Nothing reframes a stalemate like a fresh round of strikes and a declaration that diplomacy failed because the other side is unreasonable. I'm not saying that's the only reason. I am saying it's hard to look at the timing and conclude domestic politics plays no role in when wars restart. Which brings us to the NATO summit itself, in Ankara, Turkey, this week, because this is the story most people are actually seeing in their headlines, and it only makes sense once you know everything above. Trump arrived already frustrated with European allies, a long-running theme for him, his core complaint being that Europe doesn't spend enough on its own defense. This year he added a new grievance: frustration that Europe hasn't backed the US and Israeli campaign against Iran more forcefully, even though, as I said earlier, that campaign sits outside NATO's traditional defensive mission. At the same summit, he escalated two separate disputes with member states, renewing his demand for control of Greenland, Danish territory, and suggesting that further US troop withdrawals from Europe could depend on how that plays out, while also lobbing new threats at Spain. And then came the moment that made headlines everywhere. At the summit, Trump declared he considers the Iran ceasefire over, called further negotiation a waste of time, and described Iran's leadership in harshly personal terms, at one point calling them scum. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, responded that Tehran would not answer vulgarity with vulgarity, but would answer with action fearlessly. There were still a few areas of agreement. Trump met separately with Ukraine's president on the summit sidelines and floated letting Ukraine license and produce Patriot missile systems domestically. And NATO's official closing declaration reaffirmed Article 5 and stated that Iran must never be allowed a nuclear weapon. But the headline out of Ankara wasn't unity. It was the world's most powerful military alliance struggling to hold a straight face while its most powerful member threatened two of his own allies and declared a separate war back on, all in the same 72 hours. Let's widen the lens one more time, because the mistake most coverage makes is treating this as a bilateral conflict between two countries. It isn't, it's a regional system, and the other nodes in that system have been unusually quiet, which is itself a strategic choice, not an absence of capability. There's a ceasefire in southern Lebanon that has functioned, by most accounts, as a largely one-sided pause, Hezbollah holding back its offensive posture while Israeli strikes on the south have continued. Hezbollah's public posture through this period has been defensive, absorbing strikes, holding ground, rather than committing everything it has. An organization that reveals only a fraction of its strength while absorbing losses for months isn't an organization on the back foot, it's one playing a long game, letting the other side spend resources first. There's also Yemen, which rarely gets serious airtime in Western coverage, where some regional reports describe cracks appearing in the informal air and naval restrictions that have constrained the country's contact with the outside world for the better part of a decade. If accounts like that hold up, it's a meaningful signal because once a restriction gets tested and doesn't hold, precedents in this region tend to get repeated. And there's Iraq, which is not simply a funeral. Millions of Iraqis turning out in the summer heat to receive a foreign leader's coffin is a data point about where loyalties actually sit beneath the surface of Iraqi politics. And it's not a comfortable data point for anyone hoping to keep Iraq firmly in Washington's orbit. So zoom out, and what you have isn't one war. It's a lattice of restrained actors, each holding back the majority of their capability, each watching the others, each calibrating how much to reveal based on what the central conflict between Washington and Tehran does next. That's precisely the kind of environment where the interesting question isn't who wins a single battle, it's what happens to everyone's incentives the moment one player decides the restrained equilibrium isn't worth maintaining anymore. Here's my actual forecast, and I'll hold myself to it the way I try to hold myself to all of these. I don't think we're looking at an immediate, all-front regional war in the next few days. The funeral proceedings only just concluded with Khamenei's burial in Mashhad, and no actor benefits from overshadowing that moment with a wider military opening, not Iran, which wants the world's attention on its dead leader rather than its next move, and arguably not whoever's positioning to strike, who'd prefer their own reasons for escalation to stand apart from the emotional weight of a mass funeral. Once that mourning period fully passes, the probability of broader confrontation rises sharply, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a formal declaration of renewed offensive posture from at least one of the currently restrained parties within weeks rather than months. If the US strategy stays limited to air power strikes, sanctions, drone losses, the current equilibrium probably holds in a degraded but recognizable form, an ugly, rolling exchange rather than a full continental fire. But if there's any move toward ground operations, any attempt to seize or hold Iranian soil, the calculation changes entirely, and not in the way a lot of American commentary seems to assume. The air campaign already represents an enormous commitment of precision munitions and platform hours. A ground incursion against a state that's had 4 months to study exactly how the opening strike was conducted is not the same operation as the opening strike. Expeditions launched to finish a war that public opinion at home has already convinced itself should have ended earlier almost always cost more than their planners advertise, and the cost tends to be paid in a currency that's very difficult to hide once the numbers cross a certain threshold. I want to end on the piece of this that I think gets the least attention, because it isn't military at all, it's symbolic, and symbols move populations in ways satellite imagery can't capture. The choice to route the fallen leader's coffin through Najaf and Karbala, through the shrines tied to the death of a figure whose own killing, delivered mid-prayer in the immediate aftermath of a peace agreement 14 centuries ago, sits at the founding trauma of an entire religious tradition, was not an accident of geography. It was a deliberate act of narrative construction. A leader killed while his government was still at the negotiating table, brought to rest beside a leader killed while his government was still at the negotiating table, 14 centuries apart. You don't need to share the religious framework to recognize what that gesture is doing. It tells tens of millions of people across multiple countries that this death fits inside a much older story about betrayal after peace, and that the emotional resonance of that older story now attaches itself to the present conflict. States that manage to fuse a live political grievance with a foundational religious memory are playing for outcomes measured in generations, not news cycles. That is a much harder thing to bomb into submission than an air defense battery. So where does that leave us? A war that paused without resolving, a leadership structure that survived an assassination clearly designed to end it, a regional network of allied actors deliberately withholding most of their strength while they watch whether restraint is still the correct strategy, a NATO alliance built for one kind of war being dragged, awkwardly, toward the edges of another, while its own members get threatened by the ally who's dragging them, and a domestic political calendar in Washington that rewards decisive-sounding action over patient diplomacy. No matter what the situation on the ground actually supports, put those pieces together and you get exactly what you'd predict from the model. Not a peace, but an intermission. History rarely announces which act of a war is the last one. It tends to become obvious only afterward, to people who wish they'd paid closer attention while it was still unfolding. I'll be watching what happens once the mourning period fully ends. And specifically watching Lebanon and Yemen for the first real signal, because in a system this interconnected, the next move rarely comes from where the last headline was.